blonde brownies, we will need flour, granulated sugar, brown sugar. We'll use margarine instead of butter. We also need baking soda, salt, vanilla, eggs, and semi-sweet chocolate chips. The equipment needed to make blonde brownies includes 2 mixing bowls. We'll need dry measuring cups and measuring spoons, a straight edge spatula, custard cups, a wire whisk, a wooden spoon, a thin bladed metal turner, a jelly roll pan, a hand mixer or a portable mixer, a rubber scraper, and we'll use cooking spray to grease the jelly roll pan. The first ingredient we're going to measure for our blonde brownies is our flour. We need 2 1/4 cups of flour, so we're going to use dry measuring cups and a straight edge spatula to measure our flour. First, whenever you're measuring flour or other dry ingredients, it's always a good idea to stir the dry ingredients before measuring. Flour especially tends to pack down, even just sitting around in your kitchen. So we're going to stir, we're going to add a little bit of air back to that. And then whenever we measure a dry ingredient, like flour or powdered sugar, we spoon it into the measuring cup so that it heaps over the top, and then we level it off and move that to the mixing bowl. So the reason we do this, okay, you never measure flour this way because it packs it down and you end up with too much flour in your recipe, and that changes how it comes out, especially in something like cookies, which is what a blonde brownie is. So I heap it over, spoon it in, heap it over the top, and I level it off. And here with this, over this bowl, so this is the right amount of flour, but I also never shake or tap the bowl or the measuring cup to level it off. I always use a straight edge, because if you tap it or you shake it, what you're essentially doing is packing it down. So if this had mounds of flour on top of it, then I would just be packing all that flour into it. And I want you to see how much extra space you could actually create to have too much flour in your recipe. So if I drug it through the measuring container and packed it in there, so you can see all of this air space between the flour and the top surface, the rim, all of that could be filled with extra flour. And if I did that with each cup that I measured, then we multiply the amount of flour that's overabundant in our recipe. And like I said, that changes the recipe. So when you measure dry ingredients, you should always fill the cup with the ingredients so that it heaps over the top. For flour and powdered sugar, you spoon the ingredient in. For granulated sugar, you can scoop it in, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. For brown sugar, you can pack it in, and again, I'll show you that today. And you always level off the top of the cup using that straight edge spatula or a straight edge knife if you don't have a spatula, so that the excess falls back into the original container. And then if we have a semi-solid that's clinging to the inside of the dry measuring cup, then you're going to want to use a rubber scraper to get that out of the measuring cup and into your mixing bowl. Never tap or shake your measuring cup because it'll pack it in and you'll have too much of the ingredient. As another general reminder, I just want to mention that if a recipe calls for an ingredient and it has a verb listed with that ingredient, then it's important that you perform the action in relation to the measuring where that word is placed in relation to the ingredient. So for example, if a recipe called for sifted flour, the action is before the ingredient, so you would perform the action before measuring. If it called for flour sifted, flour comma sifted, then you would measure it and then sift it so that you get the right amount of that ingredient. Sifting adds air. Same would be true of a recipe that called for chopped nuts. Whether you measure them first and then chop them, or chop them first and then measure them, is going to make a big difference in how much of that ingredient you get in your recipe. The next two ingredients that we're going to measure are small amounts of dry ingredients. We're going to measure baking soda and salt. So when you measure small amounts of dry ingredients, you're always going to use measuring spoons, and we level them off at the rim of the spoon, again using that straight edge spatula, unless the recipe calls for a heaping amount of an ingredient. And if we were to need 1/8 of a teaspoon, we would measure this 1/4 teaspoon, level it off, and then remove half of it with the spatula or the tip of a knife. So let's see how that works. For each of these ingredients, I need 1 teaspoon, and a typical set of measuring spoons has a tablespoon, a teaspoon, a 1/2 teaspoon, and a 1/4 teaspoon. And you can remember that a tablespoon is bigger than a teaspoon because a table is bigger than a teacup. So we're going to do 1 teaspoon of salt. I'm going to scoop that up, heap it over, level it off, and add that to my bowl. And then the same thing is true for my baking soda. Now baking soda, you have to be careful. It tends to form lumps. So when you first scrape it off, you want to make sure that you don't have divots in your baking soda, or you won't have enough. So if that's the case, you can just scoop it up and start over. This is one I find sometimes I have to go back and forth a little so that I get a nice smooth measurement of baking soda. So there we've just measured small amounts of dry ingredients. Next, we're going to measure the 2 sugars that we need for this recipe. And we need 3/4 cup of each sugar. So I'm going to start with the brown sugar, which remember we pack in. And most sets do not have a 3/4 cup. This is a standard set, and it has a 1 cup, a 1/2 cup, a 1/3 cup, and a 1/4 cup or a 1/4 cup. So, but we can make 3/4. That's the important thing to remember. And there's 2 ways we can do that. We can either do a 1/2 cup plus a 1/4 cup, or we can do the 1/4 cup 3 times. So for the brown sugar, I'm going to do a 1/2 cup plus a 1/4, and I need to pack this in. And there are a couple of things to remember. Number one, as I pack it in, I do not want to hold the handle, because as I put that pressure on the cup, I'm going to end up breaking my measuring cup. So whenever I'm packing brown sugar, I always want to make sure I hold the cup portion of the measuring cup. Pack that in again so that it heaps over the top. That way I know it's well packed. And there's another thing we're going to do to make sure it's well packed before we add it to our mixing bowl. So packed in, leveled off, and then with brown sugar, we always want to check it, make sure it holds the shape of the measuring cup before we add it to our mixing bowl. So there's a 1/2 cup. Now I just need a 1/4 cup. And you may have noticed this piece of bread in my brown sugar and wonder why that's there. The bread helps the brown sugar to stay moist and pliable, and it can even help dried out brown sugar regain its proper moisture level and usefulness. So again, I'm holding that cup, keep it over, level it off, double check it, make sure it holds the shape of the cup. If it didn't, I'd just dump it back in there and start again, but it did, so we're good to go. So that's our brown sugar, 3/4 of a cup. Now we're going to measure our granulated sugar. Probably the easiest ingredient to measure, because granulated sugar we can just scoop up, level off, and add to our mixing bowl. 1, 2, 3 times with the 1/4 cup makes 3/4 cup of granulated sugar. So now we're going to look at measuring fats. Our next ingredient is 1 cup of butter or margarine softened, which softened just means I can put a fingerprint in it. And we're going to measure this by the stick method. And the stick method means you simply cut off the amount you need using the markings on the wrapper. So if we needed a tablespoon, we could just cut off a tablespoon. And the wrappers often tell you some hints to remember, like a 1/4 cup is 4 tablespoons and a 1/2 cup is 8 tablespoons. And 1 stick of margarine is 8 tablespoons. So 8 tablespoons is a 1/2 cup. That means we need both of those sticks of margarine to have enough for our recipe today. But if we weren't, and that's usually what you use the stick method for, is butter or margarine. However, if we were measuring something else like shortening or lard, and then semi-solids like yogurt and peanut butter measure the same way as these fats, we would use a dry measuring cup, and we would pack the fat down into the measuring cup, or a measuring spoon would be the same way, and then press it firmly to eliminate air pockets or air bubbles so that we fill the space completely with the ingredient. And then we'd level it off like every other ingredient so that we had exactly that amount, and we'd have to use a rubber scraper then to clean everything back out and make sure it gets into our mixing bowl. Now there is a handy tool that I keep in my kitchen that you can purchase. It's called a Wonder Cup, and I love this because when you pack it in, you pack that ingredient in, you can see right through to see if you have any air bubbles. And when you get ready to add it, instead of having to scrape it all back out, you can still level it off. It's got that flat edge. So when you get ready to add it, instead of having to scrape it all back out, you simply push the inside cylinder back up through the outside, and it scrapes it all clean, and all you have to do is clean off the top, and you have exactly what you were supposed to measure. But like I said, we just have the stick method today. So we are going to use those markings on the wrapper to know that each stick is a 1/2 cup. So to get 1 cup for our blonde brownies, we need 2 sticks. So just a couple more ingredients to talk about at this point, and we'll come back to the last 2 ingredients a little bit later in the video. So we're going to talk about eggs. Always crack your eggs into a custard cup or a small bowl if you don't have custard cups. So that way, if any shell gets in there, it's a lot easier to get out of that small space. That's probably the most common reason to use a small bowl or a custard cup for your eggs. But if there's anything wrong with the egg, then you only have to eliminate and get rid of and replace that 1 egg instead of everything that was in your mixing bowl. The other ingredient that we're going to address right now is measuring small amounts of liquids, because I need to add vanilla to this recipe. So I have 2 custard cups, 1 to measure over and 1 to hold until I'm ready to add. And so I'm going to pour the liquid into the proper size measuring spoon until the liquid begins to bubble at the edge of the spoon. And we should not see any of the interior or the inside surface of that measuring spoon. And then we'll add it, once it's bubbled at the edge, we'll add it to our recipe or to the holding dish. Now, if you needed an 1/8 of a teaspoon, remember this set does not have an 1/8 teaspoon measure, but you would simply pour vanilla into the 1/4 teaspoon measuring spoon until it looked about half full. So you'd have to estimate, but it's a small amount, so you should be okay. So let's go ahead. We're going to hold that measuring spoon over the custard cup, and we're going to add vanilla. And I have had students who stopped right here and added it, but I want you to see how much of the inside surface of that spoon is still available to fill. So that's why we have to have that bubble at the edge, and that's why we measure over something else, because really to measure it correctly, you're probably going to spill a few drops. So we're just going to put that into this custard cup to hold it until we're ready to add it to our recipe. And if the only thing that's been in that custard cup that you poured over was the vanilla itself, anything that's spilled in there can go right back into the original container. Now we're going to begin mixing together some of our ingredients. So in this small bowl, we have our flour, baking soda, and salt. And we are just going to whisk those to combine them together. And I like to use a whisk when I combine dry ingredients, or if a recipe tells me to sift dry ingredients together, because it adds air, it helps eliminate lumps, and it mixes very thoroughly. So once that's whisked together, we're just going to set that whisk aside and leave those ingredients off to the side for a few minutes. And now we're going to beat together our butter, granulated sugar, and brown sugar. And for that, we're going to use a portable mixer. It's important that we put this away in a little bit so we don't over mix our cookies. When using the mixer, if you keep it straight up and down, you have fewer things fly out of your bowl. So we're going to mix this just until it's one homogeneous mixture. So that means it all looks the same. We don't see distinctive margarine, brown sugar, or granulated sugar. Stop a minute, push that back down. Notice how I turn the bowl to get everywhere. Okay, so once it's homogeneous, I'm going to stop. You can see it all looks the same now. It's not distinctively any of the 3 ingredients that are in the bowl. So we're going to go ahead and add our 2 eggs and our teaspoon of vanilla. And then we're going to continue with that portable mixer. Again, creating a homogeneous mixture. So that everything's mixed together. We don't see sugar mixture, we don't see eggs, we don't see vanilla, but it's just all combined together. Clean off my beaters on the side. And now we're ready to start mixing together the dry ingredients into the wet ingredients. And we need to do that gradually, which means we're going to take about 1/3 of our dry and stir that together. Notice I switched to a wooden spoon. Also notice how much more space is in my mixing bowl than the ingredients take up. I need to have that room for the mixing so I have the best chance of everything staying in the bowl. Once that first third is pretty well mixed in, we're going to add the next third, or about half of what was left in the bowl. So believe it or not, this actually helps you make sure that you don't over mix it, because it's easier to mix it in stages than it is to just mix it by dumping it all in. And the more you mix it, the tougher your cookies get. Nobody wants tough cookies. So make sure all that gets in there. We'll finish mixing this. And then we need to talk about the last 2 ingredients in this recipe, which are chocolate chips and an optional cup of chopped nuts. Now for class purposes, I really don't spend the money on nuts for most recipes because they're kind of expensive. Not everybody likes them, and some people have allergies. So we're going to make these today without the chopped nuts. But we also have to talk about measuring at mix-ins. So like chocolate chips, at my house, when I'm just making cookies, I shop a little differently for the chips And I call this a cup of chocolate chips, what I measure for chips at my house. However, in a class setting like this where we have to watch our budget, or if you're in a home setting where you have to watch your budget, your chips are going to level off at the top of the cookie. So that's 1 cup. This recipe calls for 2. A 12-ounce bag of chocolate chips is exactly 2 cups. So you would not have even had to measure those if we weren't talking about measuring in this process. So we're just going to go ahead and stir this in. Now you could replace the nuts with an additional cup of chocolate chips, or I have some that I'll show you later that I made with chocolate chips and M&Ms. So we're going to just stir this enough more so that the chocolate chips are all throughout our batter, all throughout our dough, and then we're going to move it to the pan we're going to bake it on. So our recipe calls for this to be prepared in a 15 by 10 by 1 inch jelly roll pan. We switched to the wooden spoon from the portable mixer to ensure that we did not overmix our cookies. And we're going to spread this dough into a greased pan. So we're going to use cooking spray to grease the pan. And then we're just going to simply transfer all of this dough to that jelly roll pan. Remember, jelly roll pan has 1 inch sides, and a cookie sheet has no sides. Now this recipe will spread, so as long as we get everything pretty close to the edges, we should be okay. It'll fill in the rest. So we're going to use our rubber scraper to make sure that we get everything out of the bowl and onto the baking pan. And you should never eat raw cookie dough because of the risk of salmonella. So we're going to take that rubber scraper, we're going to move that dough toward all edges of the pan. Again, if it doesn't go exactly to the corner, it'll finish, it'll spread a little bit as it bakes, and it'll finish filling in all the way to the edges of the pan. So before I started measuring any ingredients, I preheated my oven to 375 degrees, and it's ready to go. So when I put these in the oven, I'm going to set the timer. The recipe says to set it for 15 to 25 minutes. And I always want to make sure that I set a timer on the lowest time, because I can always add time to my recipe, but I cannot unbake it 2 minutes if that ended up being too much. So you can see it's not quite to every single edge, but it's going to spread. It's close enough. It's going to spread and finish getting to the edges as it bakes. So I'm going to put this in an oven at 375 degrees and set the timer for 15 minutes. When I place this in the oven, it's important that I place it in the center of the oven, centered side to side and top to bottom. And I always want to make sure it's at least 2 inches away from the oven walls and any other pans that might be in there for proper air circulation so that I get good baking. So the one ingredient that this recipe did not have in a sufficient amount to demonstrate with recipe ingredients is a large amount of liquids. So I'm going to show you how to measure a liquid ingredient. So what we need to do first is we need to use a liquid measuring cup. Notice it has a pour spout. Sometimes they're made of plastic, sometimes they're made of glass. This just has some water that I've added a little food coloring to make it easier to see. So you set your measuring cup on a level surface, and you always make sure that you do not hold it up in the air, because you can't make sure that it's level for checking the measurement mark. So then we're going to carefully pour, if I want a half a cup of this liquid, we're going to carefully pour it into what we think is the half cup line. And then, so we carefully pour it into the measuring cup, and then we bend down to check it at eye level for an accurate reading. We add more liquid, or we pour off the excess until the liquid is at the desired measurement mark. And so we bend down and we check it, and it is right at the half cup line, so that's perfect. And if this were a thick liquid that stuck to the sides of the cup when we poured it out, we'd want to make sure that we scraped it clean with a rubber scraper. And when you're measuring clear liquids, you want to make sure that the meniscus, or that curve formed by the surface of the liquid, is at the measurement mark when you're checking to see if you have the exact amount needed or not. When your blonde brownies come out of the oven, there'll be a nice golden brown color. You can see that the dough made it all the way to the edges of the pan, even though it didn't start there. And they should cool in the pan until they're completely cool, and they'll cool faster if you place the pan on a wire cooling rack. Now we use 2 cups of chocolate chips, but you could do a variety of different mix-ins up to 4 cups. You could add M&Ms, or a mixture of chocolate chips, peanut butter chips, white chocolate chips, toffee chips. You could add nuts if you like those. So there's a lot of different things that you could try, and in a moment I'll show you one other variety that I made with this recipe. So you can see here the end results of our proper measuring. We have 2 recipes of blonde brownies, one prepared with the standard recipe, just the 2 cups of chocolate chips, and the other with some additional mix-ins, some M&Ms. It's important to make sure that you don't go over about 4 cups of mix-ins, and when you add more mix-ins, you may find that you need a slightly longer bake time to make sure that everything gets done. But either way, if you decide to make these, I think you'll find that they're delicious. So I hope you enjoy making blonde brownies and have learned a lot about measuring properly. Because if you can measure your ingredients properly, you can make just about anything.